I'm going to welcome Michael Withrow, Director of AI Cybersecurity for Microsoft. Michael, come on out. Hey, how are you, sir?
Yeah.
Great to see you.
Yeah, you as well.
Great to see you. All right. So first, here with Michael, myself, we're going to talk about a lot today as it relates to managing the risk in the age of AI. So AI has already or is already integrated in all of our systems, right? Increasingly into our attackers' arsenals. The threat landscape is shifting fast. Traditional security models are struggling to keep up. We've heard a lot of that already today. And organizations any size are feeling the pressure. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about some practical insights, some real-world examples, strategies that work. Doesn't matter the size of the organization. And we'll dive in and explore what's changing, what's working, what's not working. So first, before we get into the topics itself, I want to have Michael introduce himself.
Thank you. I guess a little bit about myself. So I started out in the intelligence community about 9 or so years in the intelligence community. Back then, a couple other people mentioned this as well. Our idea of cybersecurity was basically disconnecting the network cable from a server or basically having a firewall in place, right? So obviously, a lot of things have changed since then. From there, I kind of started in Microsoft. Like I said, I've been doing cybersecurity about 25 years or so. Started in Microsoft, then moved into the product group. We essentially, from there, when Docker was first invented, we realized there was no security for that, so I left Microsoft and built a company called Twistlock, which is part of the Prisma Cloud suite as well. Once we sold that to Prisma, so to speak, I came back to Microsoft, worked in engineering again, and was building cybersecurity capabilities. So a lot of the talks that actually came out today, I want to dive into because it's very, very relevant to what AI is today, what the security strategy is, and how we build products and how we help secure them from a capability point of view.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. Just for those that don't know me just yet, right? Ed Hayes, VP of Cybersecurity, running the Cyber Risk Management Program. The reason I'm up here today is I'm also responsible for the Cyber Security AI program inside of AT&T as well. So I figured it'd be good for us to sit down and talk and have a pretty in-depth discussion in terms of AI security. So let's start with the basics, right? So when we talk about risks, it's easy to jump straight into what our external threats are and what that looks like. But the truth is you can't protect what you don't know, right? I think you heard a lot of that in terms of the basics of what we need to do. So the first step in managing AI risk is knowing your inventory. Michael.
Yeah, so obviously, if you look at it from a traditional perspective, AI is no different, but obviously the inventory is paramount, right? If you don't know what you have, how do you know what the state is in from a capabilities point of view, right? So you look at your models, you look at your projects that you're building now with agents and everything coming out, MCP servers, all the different things like that exist. Obviously, people are building them everywhere. This is big mesh of capabilities. If you don't know what you have, you don't know what your security state is.
That's true. And you heard Jason Hamilton talk about it before. Every place he's been to, he's had issues with inventory, right? And now that AI is moving as fast and rapidly as it is, it's that much more important to understand what's out there, what the inventory looks like in order to secure it.
And the scale is through the roof.
Yep, that's right. So the next question is what's coming at IT, right? So can you talk a little bit about some of the threats and some of the threat vectors that you're seeing?
Yeah. So I think that's an interesting topic to kind of move off of the inventory, right? So what's important if you look at it from a traditional security perspective, once you kind of understand the inventory, the next thing you kind of understand is what's the posture of that inventory, right? We heard a lot of conversations about that, secure by default as an example. So to kind of dive in that a little bit, I don't know if everybody here has heard of Microsoft SFI. We've done a lot of publishing about this from a strategy perspective. If you heard the earlier guy that mentioned about the CISA talks and stuff like that, we essentially learned ourselves. Like I said, if we're building products, we have always been a software factory, right? And so one of the things that we learned is that we were essentially not shipping security with those capabilities. They always came after the fact, right? And we don't have a lot of this stuff on by default. And so obviously the big thing now is what's the posture of these capabilities, right, as we kind of go through.
Sure.
Now, there is some work that we're doing through SFI to kind of dovetail into that as well, that eventually, if you look at all these security capabilities, like I'm building a server, there's these normal security capabilities I need around that to close the attack vectors. I have a storage account. Here's the turn off SaaS keys, turn off public endpoint. These normal things, which all relate to your AI stuff as you're kind of going through. Same thing with your clusters, whatever it might be. There's a set of security controls that are there, which leads to these posture management capabilities needed to be out there. But if all these controls are on by default, do you need posture? right? Because it's there, everything's on control, and now you're just
Sure.
assessing if your posture is still holding, as an example.
Yeah.
And so these are some of the things we're essentially looking at from once we have that inventory to understand as an entry level, before the attack actually happens, what is the state of your inventory, right, to lead to an attack? And I'll talk about some principles that I have here in a couple minutes as well.
Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds good. So let's, as we continue this conversation here, let's talk a little bit about what Roman said earlier. I think struck fear in a lot of people's eyes here. I had talked to people out in the hallway, and they were like, yeah, that was scary. So is it true that AI agents can potentially go off script? And if that is true, how do we prevent or address that type of risk?
Well, I guess to your point, when you look at agents, right, and we can couple agents from agentic agents as we kind of go through, but obviously agents can live anywhere, right? So we have customers that are talking about building them inside of Foundry, so all your agents are in a single topology. So obviously from a governance perspective, I can build a good governance posture around that. But now as I start building agents where my models are, like I'm in Salesforce or ServiceNow and building agents out there, how do I essentially extend out the governance model to these particular topologies, right? And then when you add in agentic on top of that, and now they're starting to spin up their own capabilities with agents, grabbing identities and scaling out from there, that's also going to be the future of the risk kind of going through. And so as we look at it from our perspective, essentially what we're trying to understand is, I guess the big thing you look at it from a control perspective, within the Entra suite, we've enabled a capability called Agent ID, right? So whether it's a physical user that has a managed identity with them, and then you have RBAC and role permissions off of that, we're also now building that across the agentic side, right? So when you scale out those agents, you now have let's say that identity control. You can build RBAC on that. More importantly, you can do conditional access. So think of like a rogue agentic agent kind of going across. You can only go as far as the conditional access goes. Or from an attack perspective, I've actually grabbed the managed identity, now I want to move laterally, but I can't break the conditional access policies as an example to start helping control essentially what's there, right? And so as these agents scale across the topology, whether they're agentic, whether they're AI built within Azure, outside of Azure, multi-cloud, on-prem, SaaSified, whatever they might be, understand what you have, understand the topology, understand the blast radius of them, and then basically make sure they're Entra enabled. And then there's another big capability that we're announcing next week at Ignite called AI Gateway as well. And so if you look at it from an agent perspective, there's two things that we look at from a governance perspective is obviously what's the identity it's using, what's the state of that identity, and then secondly, what's the network that it's traversing across, right? So through our Entra suite, we can extend out the network controls. So if you think about your full mesh of agents that you have across the globe, that essentially allows you to bring in underneath your governance umbrella to start to control them.
Okay. All right, so I mean, it sounds like it all, again, ties back to the beginning of what
If you don't have the inventory, you don't know what to extend.
Don't have the inventory, right? I mean, you listed multiple types of agents that could be out there, understanding what all of those are.
Yep.
And then the next part to that is understanding the blast radius, right? I think, going back to more traditional cybersecurity, that's a very important thing.
Agents is another way to get get access to data, right? So traditional controls still hold true.
Okay.
To an extent.
Fair enough. And then what about understanding the data sensitivity and access around that?
So obviously at the end of the day, one of the biggest, most important things is, like we started to allude to this, a couple of the different talks that kind of go through is, hey, the danger of AI, right? So think of it now being able to go through and grab anything that has. So whether I have a model itself and a prompt into the model, or I have an agent that's talking into the model to grab data as well, if I don't have a data governance policy around that, whatever it has access to from roles and responsibility perspective, and what it's going to return. So you think about like a brand harm perspective and all these kind of things like that. We've already seen massive impacts across the SOC team about what type of data people are referencing. Like, think of, you're just now worrying about a CV or an endpoint, but now imagine getting an image with very malicious content in there. What do you do as a SOC team about that, right, as an example? So having restriction of the content from a governance perspective is kind of like the entry-level strategy when you start to release out AI. So a lot of people talked about, obviously AI is very, very scary. Well, if you don't have governance model around your AI, then you just open up the keys to the kingdom.
Sure. So, I mean, I think we've talked a lot about AI. You heard Rich talk about it as well. There is pretty much fundamental items that you need to make sure you're doing, right? So that's your more traditional, but there is some fundamental difference as it relates to traditional security when it comes to AI. So it's tooling, right? So I think it's a shift in mindset. So it's not just tooling, it's a shift in mindset. So can you talk a little bit about, maybe platform-based security and what that includes?
Yeah, so one of the things that we learned with AI, which I think was very foundational as well. So if we back up a little bit, inside of Microsoft, we were customer zero. We started our AI journey about 3 years ago, right? And what we got out of that is we took the output as learnings for ourselves, which we fed into the products. And one of the things that we found, and I was already talking to a couple of people out here, we were just like every other enterprise. We had 80 different tools that are running. They're all different. They have a different SIM. They have a different identity, different team that's running them. They all work in stovepipes, right? But when you look at the AI attack surface, that doesn't scale. So what we had to start thinking about was essentially think about it from a platform-based approach, right? So moving to a platform-based set of capabilities. So we're a software factory. We've always been building tools, like I said, but we build a server, a capability to lock down a server, a capability to lock down a container, whatever it might be. But all these might be part of the architecture, and any one of those can be an attack vector into your AI-based model. So what we started to do is you might have heard our Sentinel Data Lake release capability that we had. So we started out by essentially building a data lake first and foremost, which came out a couple of months ago. We just announced last week a graph API on top of that. So now that we know from an inventory perspective, every single thing that you have, now from an API perspective, we can build a blast radius off of this topology, right? Sure. Then the most important thing is now we're taking every single one of our security tools. So think Intra, think Defender, think Purview, and all these different capabilities, plugging them into this graph, and then attaching Copilot to it. Right? So now, when something happens, obviously now I can not only see the entity, but I see the entire topology of what's actually happening. Now I can get into my SOC experience to start to move into certain things like, hey, look, I'm getting blasted by a DDoS on an agent, right? So I've got 50,000 agents, so I got 50,000 DDoS alerts to kind of go through. No SOC team can essentially manage that, right? But if I had XDR capabilities, we have a capability called automatic attack disruption. I don't know if you've heard about this as well. That comes inside of our XDR stack as well. And essentially, to kind of dive into what that is and where we're kind of going from a tooling perspective, now that we have everything integrated together, we tie everything in, we've got our CNAPP capability. You want to use Palo or Wiz from a CNAPP, it doesn't really matter. We're going to an agnostic approach. You tie all this in, it feeds into the graph, we build the blast radius off of this, and then we could turn on automatic attack disruption. So as an example, someone attacks an identity which is associated to your AI or to your storage account. We can actually kill that identity, lets you have a ticket, so now your SOC team can deal with that, because most attacks happen when you go home, right, as an example. And so now that we have that base set of capabilities, what we've been very focused on is how can we alleviate the SOC teams, right? Especially with the scale. You've heard everybody talking about the scale of everything that's coming out. So more and more threats, the cyber attackers are using it, and that's before AI comes out. It really kind of started when you move applications to the cloud, right? It's just a commodity of scale when you think about it.
Sure.
Right? And so now, with that evolution, as you keep scaling out those entities, now I can just automate everything out.
Okay. So, it sounds like it's a transformative way of how we're going to evolve the SOCs and what that's going to look like and what we want it to look like in the future. Certainly, from a scalability perspective, we use AI in order to help defend, in order to help triage. Yeah, there's like I said, there's an attack perspective and a defense perspective that we kind of go through, right? Which kind of gets into the skill set shifts, right, to your point. So there's a couple of different levels that we learned ourselves from a capability point of view. Obviously, on our SOC side, we learned a lot of different capabilities. Like I said, different kind of content coming in, different set of threat actors coming in that we essentially saw, and then the scale is through the roof. Like I said, I've already talked to a customer that just eclipsed 50,000 agents. I talked to a CISO that is planning to get almost to 1 billion agents by the end of 2027, right? So you may look at like a traditional SOC team. If those 1 billion agents get attacked through an AI engine, you just get 1 billion alerts. Nobody can triage that, right? Just kind of go through. And so understanding that scale and having tooling that can help you with that scale, because we're building agentic capabilities inside of our XDR capability as well. So think of like a traditional set of, say, SOC teams is, hey, look, I've got 4 or 5 people that are running my SOC, right? Okay, great. And they're usually handling, say, a triage of, say, 1,000 applications, maybe 10,000 incidents a day or whatever it is. That's kind of like my portfolio. Now I turn on AI, like I said, and now I've got 500,000 to kind of go through. So what we foresee is happening is starting to couple
through the identity structure, through the agentic structure with that SOC team, also agentic capabilities, right?
Yeah.
So think of like triage capabilities. So I can augment my SOC team with these agentic capabilities and then start to offload some of that work, right?
Yeah.
So you still have human intervention, human governance on top of that, but agentic's taken 60% of that workload, 50% of that workload, especially at that scale. And that's one of the ways that we're starting to think about how we can help these teams as this scale comes in.
Okay, so it's about that training aspect of it. I think Roman mentioned, everyone says, am I going to lose my job? So it sounds like people will still have a job.
Yeah,
that's good.
Because the concern is when I turn agentic on, right, if I don't have anybody to govern agentic, it's going to run away, right? And so you still need some level of human interaction to govern the policy of how that agentic works, right? So who's going to build the conditional access policy? Who's going to build the network path? Who's going to associate the RAG data that they can associate with, the LLMs they can associate with, as an example? There's a level of control that will always be there, right? And as we go agentic, that control is going to be more and more needed.
Yeah. No, I mean, even in my own organization, in the broader security organization, AT&T, I mean, this is what we're thinking about, right? We're thinking about your traditional skill sets in terms of what security is and then what it needs to look like, right? You heard Jason talk about it. He sat down with his daughters. He said, you got to learn AI. I think we're trying to figure out how we're going to do that for the future, right? Because everybody has to be able to do their job with that AI association and or become an expert in that space, but use your institutional knowledge in order to apply it.
Yep, it's all foundational knowledge as you go up.
Okay. So now that we've unpacked how AI is reshaping security strategy and team structure, let's talk about the tools, right? So the right tools are important in both defending and detecting. So the simple question I'd ask you, Michael, is what's helping, what's hurting?
All right, where's the slide?
We're working on that.
Okay.
Gary? No.
Yeah, so I guess I can kind of, there we go. Thank you. All right. So, like I said, the big thing, you kind of look at this slide, there's a lot going on, and that's on purpose, right? Essentially, what we're working on, just like every other vendor is working on, is essentially, hey, look, there's multiple attack vectors that exist. So think of this as our journey from a Microsoft perspective. First and foremost, if we go back 3 years, what we first wanted to understand fundamentally was, what is the threat landscape, right? Because it's ever evolving, and oh, by the way, it's changed a little bit as well, right? And it's always changing. But we wanted to have a lens on what the threat vectors were, right? So first and foremost, we mapped these out. Then what we wanted to do was an initial swap across that and go, okay, well, what products do we have out of the box that can close these vectors, right, as we kind of go through. So you start to see Purview, Entra, MDA, and I'll talk about this a little bit in depth as we kind of go through. But obviously, there's a fundamental flaw with this, right? This doesn't lead into the platform approach. There's still 50 products here, right, or whatever it is, right? So think of this as like a point in time of where we're going, right? And so what we're starting to do behind the scenes, and we're going to announce a lot of stuff next week at Ignite, is starting to bridge all these capabilities together, right, into an AI landing zone, right? So all these capabilities are here, but you're getting data from Entra, you're getting data from the gateway, you're getting data from Purview about your governance, as an example, that's feeding this set of capabilities in. But as you look at it, like we talked about earlier, obviously the number one thing that I talk to customers, I go across the globe and talk to customers about, hey, I want to go into AI, what's the first thing I need to solve? It's data governance, right? So I need to make sure I know what my sensitive data is. I need to know what my policy around the sensitive data is. So when I bring AI into that topology, it's not responding out with data that user shouldn't have. Should a developer in there should have every single buddy's paycheck or social security number as an example? That's the one I always use. The answer is no to that, right? So you have the data governance policy to make sure that the right people have access to the right content. Then you turn on AI, which will follow those governance rule concepts. On top of that, I couple that with Entra. We have a capability called Agent ID, which is now, as you start to move into agentic, that's looking at the agent topology as well and scaling that out and marrying together, here's your data governance policy and here's who is using that data governance policy. So now when something happens, now I have the backend log to kind of show that topology.
Sure.
When we look at Shadow IT, that comes through Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, right? What's really nice from an AT&T perspective, this is all just part of your E5 license, right? So it's not a net new set of capabilities. It's just a matter of turning them on and consuming them. right, as we kind of go through. And then lastly, the other big thing I'll kind of talk about is down in the middle, this is where our biggest evolution from a product perspective came from, right? Like I said, we're used to building cybersecurity products, but one of the things that was very fundamentally different is, hey, and it's just a prompt. How do I deduce a good prompt and a bad prompt, right? If I only know about the prompt itself. So what's important is, what is it referencing? Am I in network? Am I out of network? Am I referencing sensitive data? Am I not referencing sensitive data? Who is the user? Do they have rights to this data? All these factors actually dictate, from a threat perspective, if that prompt is malicious or not, right? So if we just built Defender for AI and looked at the prompt, we would never have that telemetry. So we had to look at, peer it into Purview to actually look at the data construct off that prompt injection as well. So this is where the marriage of the products essentially come in. And then lastly, we have Azure AI. And this is where things are essentially, for us, is really, really important as well. So this is our what we call Foundry. So once we started our OpenAI work, we started with OpenAI as a project, but there was no governance around this, right? And so and this is part of our SFI learning as well, because we can't ship a product we don't have security, right? So what we actually did with Foundry was essentially took our responsible AI capabilities, productized them into content safety, and then basically shipped them as a native part of Foundry, right? So when I go through, obviously I can turn on those filters, starts to block against malicious prompts, start to block against harmful prompts, and all those kind of things like that. But that also dovetails down into the bottom as well. So if we look at down here on the model theft side as well, there was a couple of mentions about red teaming as well. Red teaming is very, very important. If you look at the fundamental shift that we had to go through ourselves, which is very, very interesting, was traditional red teaming doesn't work when you go into AI, right? There's two key reasons for that. Is one, if you're red teaming an application, you're red teaming a server or a database or whatever it is, it always has a beginning and an end. And there's traditional people that have skills around that to do the red teaming, right? But now I'm looking at native language interaction. I'm looking at crescendo attacks and different ways to attack through native language. It's a little bit of an adaptation of a different skill set. So what we essentially learned was there was a couple of paths that we can go through. We actually built a separate, what we call AI red teaming, which is separate from our traditional red team. Right? And what they learned right out of the gate was, like I said, this is very, very hard. It's ever evolving. And so what we did is open sourced it. So through GitHub, we published a project called Pirate, which is all the Python scripts for all the harmful content that comes through the prompts, right? Then with Azure AI, we actually dumped that inside of Azure AI as well, under red teaming, right? So now I'm a developer, depending on what persona I am. I'm a developer, I'm a SecOps resource. I can essentially run perpetual red teaming, which will now protect me from the bottom, right? Which is now, thinking about your pipeline-based stuff, is we know, we've seen attacks already where bad actors are attacking GitHub or ADO, because now you're not building applications or containers there, now you're building LLMs or SLMs. Right? So if I can get into the build pipeline, it's got an identity as well. That's where the source code is. I can jump onto that build pipeline. I can do a bunch of different things. Yeah. But by bringing all these capabilities together, now I can protect from those LLM-based attacks.
Sure. No, yeah. So we've actually ourselves been doing a lot of red teaming as it relates to our AI solutions, and the tool set in which the AI teams come with is much different than what the tool set used to look like. Yeah. And in addition to that, I mean, just understanding exactly what they're finding, how they're finding it, and what they're doing to find it, it's just a completely different view on what that looks like.
Yeah, like I said, now the effort is really about bringing this into a cohesive view. So these are some announcements we're doing next at Ignite into that landing zone. Yep.
Okay. Couple other things. I think one last thing I want to talk about, and then we'll turn it over to some questions. But I think big topic always, a big topic here at AT&T is MCP agents, right? And so let's talk a little bit about how we can effectively leverage them, how we can make sure we have the right protections around them, usage, what we should use, what we shouldn't use.
Sure. So once again, MCP is just really an API directory, right? And so it's just like with everything else with AI, it's an evolving set of capabilities. So we're having a lot of foundational discussions at Microsoft about what the future of MCP is. Like right now, it's a separate entity. I can build it as part of a container. I can build it on a server, on my laptop, attached to my GitHub. There's a bunch of different use cases for it. So what we're starting to see already is that a lot of customers are having MCP sprawl. So before we even get into agent sprawl, now we've got MCP sprawl.
Yep.
Well, an MCP server is just an API directory, so obviously it's got multiple attack vectors that exist against it, right? So first and foremost, you want to be able to inventory that, right? Just kind of go through, and then we can start to protect those different threat vectors. But more importantly, there's still some evolutions that are coming in from the ecosystem, right? From that are essentially there. So instead of having the sprawl of MCP servers, because it's really just a set of APIs, there's really a concerted effort to bring those agents together. As an example, we just announced a couple weeks ago an Azure MCP. And the reason that was important is you probably, if you follow the track, we released an MCP server for SQL, released an MCP server for storage, released an MCP server for AKS. So now we had hundreds of different MCP servers, which required a customer to deploy 100 MCP servers. Well, we said, well, that's a flawed strategy. We went back and said, here's an Azure MCP, which has all the API servers. That's great. But from a security perspective, if I can compromise that MCP server, I've just got all of Azure, right? So knowing about that, having the controls around that are going to be paramount, whether you have one MCP server or 1,000, right? We have a lot of customers that are essentially having their developers. They've offboarded their developer ecosystem, and they're essentially having thousands of MCP servers across their topology as well.
Okay. Last topic I'm gonna bring up because between folks in the room, but also folks that are online, not every organization has a humongous budget, right? It's not like it's countless funding that's coming towards us. It was a topic that was brought up today in earlier discussions. What can smaller teams do in order to help defend against the AI risk?
Yeah, so obviously we want to make sure these tools are available, right? And so at the end of the day, the price to secure the model should be a subset of the price of the model itself. That's essentially the fair way from a pricing perspective. We're still doing some work. As an example, everybody might be aware of Microsoft. We make it super hard from a licensing perspective. We're changing the way we do licensing as well, coming up as well. But the idea that we're kind of looking at is we want everybody to be secure when you're using your AI, right? So we're trying to figure out from a pricing perspective where that line sits. So if you're deploying an 03 mini, it costs X, but you deploy an 05 mini, it should be a little bit cheaper. But if you're deploying an 05 nano, it's a little bit more expensive. So think of the cost as kind of going with your models. And that's one of the constructs that we're essentially looking at to make it fair and balanced.
Okay, makes sense. All right, I think we got just a little bit of time left. We'll cut over to Q&A.
Okay, perfect. Are there any questions here in the room? If so, raise your hand and we'll have a mic runner come over to you. There's one question.
2 minutes over?
No, we're 45 seconds.
Okay.
Thank you.
45 seconds.
Yeah, appreciate that. You talked a lot about the Microsoft story when it came to the ecosystem, a lot of it in I would say, the prod environment. What's the story with kind of getting earlier than that in the pipelines and GitHub, and how is that going to tie in, or how do you see that tying in with some of these agentic AI?
No, it's a good point. So obviously, the further left you can go from a security perspective is important. So obviously, extending all the way into the build pipeline is important. So the more reactive you can be on security, just like with everything else, is going to be important.
Yes.
So through our GitHub capabilities, through our ADO capabilities, as developers are building there, obviously we can detect vulnerabilities that sits in your LLMs. You're building MCP servers there. We can help inventory those MCP servers and look at it across the entire ecosystem. Right? So we don't just look at it from a prod perspective. We don't even really care anymore. Now, that's a changing conversation, but we don't even really care if you're in Azure anymore, right? The idea is that you're deploying AI and you want to use AI. So you need a single lens to see all of your AI and what's going on with your AI. Whether it's in build pipeline, whether it's in another cloud, whether it's on-prem, whether you're just using Copilot or Gemini, doesn't really matter. AI is AI.
Excellent. So unfortunately, we are at time. I really, really appreciate Michael. Thank you so much. Appreciate you coming out here.
Thank you.
Thank you.